Welcome to episode 25 of Lift as We Rise. My name is Roshni Gajjar. This week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, global healthcare leaders, amongst other things, will be discussing the balance between incentives and legislation when it comes to sustainable access to healthcare data so that we can aim towards improving lives. On Lift as We Rise today, far from Davos and in a far sunnier southern hemisphere between South Africa and Australia, I have the pleasure of speaking to the CEO and founder of Unleash Health. Unleash Health is a startup company that's leveraging the power of big brands to create a healthier world. Dr. Ramin Rafiei, it's a pleasure to finally be speaking to you today. Welcome to our podcast.
Roshni, it's a pleasure to join you from beautiful sunny Sydney, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you on unleashing health equity across the globe.
Thanks, Ramin. I think those in the Northern Hemisphere are particularly envious about our bright sunshine, so let's not gloat too much on it. So you're a non-executive director and a board chairman across a number of US-based VC and private equity-backed healthcare and technology companies. You're also a trusted advisor to life sciences companies and a faculty member at the University of California, San Diego on digital healthcare. Dr. Ramin, you are passionate, it seems, about healthcare and on a mission to improve 1 billion lives by 2033. I was particularly struck by your bold vision. What led you to that? And what gives you the courage to call big brands to action?
Look, a mission of this scale, Roshni, doesn't just emerge overnight. I think it comes with a big responsibility because with a very high degree of confidence, we've set that as the North Star for Unleash Health. And it really is the byproduct of my own personal journey to date. If we rewind the clock, I come from an immigrant academic family. When you sit around the dinner table in that environment, you're typically surrounded by scientists, physicians, and academics. And so you, to a large extent, you mold and you become your environment. And so I trained in experimental nuclear physics. And I was quite fortunate at quite a young age. I accelerated up the academic ranks and kind of molded into the ideal, let's call it, son in the family. It was during those academic years that I met my mentor from Stanford. And he really gave me what I would call the courage to follow a path that was least traveled. And on his words, I resigned from what I would call a very well paved career trajectory. And that really was the beginning of life as an entrepreneur. Now, you might think, well, where does healthcare come into the picture? And unfortunately, soon after I resigned from my professorship, I fell ill. And that really, from there on, there was a 12-month battle to recover. I spent the most of that time in the hospital. And to a large extent, the way I like to describe the start of my journey in this industry is I was probably one of the most loyal customers of the medical economy. 12 months in and out of the hospital, having to get retrained on speaking, eating, very basic functions which we all take for granted, gave me this depth of perspective on the challenges that the healthcare industry has. In particular, what I witnessed was what at that time I always referenced as an invisible hand, but now we know much better, we call it financial incentives, which within the medical economy are not always centered and focused around the best outcomes for patients. And for me, also what was truly fascinating is we call it a healthcare system, yet we only utilize it when we're sick. And so with total naivety, I decided that the moment I recover and I can walk out of this hospital standing up on my own feet, I'm going to go into the medical economy because I want to change it. And so I guess with naivety comes a certain level of braveness and boldness. And so that journey took me from the hospital bed to the back of a shopping mall in the city of Taoyuan in the country of Taiwan, where I joined a company, a medical device company that had just started stepping out of what I would call startup phase. And this company, 5 years fast forward, emerged to become a world leader in medical devices. Now, I always say the first inflection point for me was being a patient, a patient of 12 months. But the second inflection point was the blessing to be part of SHL Medical and be part of a company that grew exponentially over that 5-year period and brought to market a very noble product, an auto-injector. And an auto-injector, very simply put, brings independence, safety to patients so they can administer therapies, typically a biologic or a biosimilar, in the comfort of their home. So whether today we're hearing a lot about biologics like Wegovy and Ozempic all over the news because of the miraculous power of helping everyday consumers and patients lose weight. So whether it's those, let's call them semaglutides, or whether it's a biologic of the nature of Repatha or Praluent, which is a PCSK9 for hyperlipidemia, these are all miracle drugs. They help patients with chronic conditions better manage their lives and live better and independent. But our exponential growth signaled one thing, and that is society is getting sicker. It demonstrated the exponential growth in chronic conditions in society. And it was at that point where, for me, I felt obliged to shift the conversation from disease management to prevention. And this was the birth of Unleash.
Yeah, and that really is, a classic example of certainly the entrepreneurs I worked with. We talk about calculated risk when you start an entrepreneurship journey, but it often are those deep-rooted experiences that shape the entrepreneurial purpose, and it certainly sounds like that was the case for you. Difficult, but it helped you understand, why you want to wake up in the morning and what impact you want to have on the world at large.
Absolutely. And I must say, never in my life have I been at a point where every morning I wake up, it's a day full of energy. It's a day that is truly meaningful. Every second of it, knowing that Unleash's mission of improving the health of 1 billion people is our guiding North Star. It's something that drives myself and the entire team at Unleash.
Ramin, if we look back to what's happened in the last 3 years, I think every crisis is in some way also a blessing. And what COVID-19 certainly showed up for everybody is the fragility of the healthcare systems across the world. And maybe fragility is a diplomatic term. It's really the deep-seated inequality around healthcare systems. In UK at the moment, they're really struggling with the NHS. In South Africa, I can share with you that we have two extremes. We have a very efficient private healthcare system that serves about 16% of the population. So 8 billion of 50 billion South Africans are on healthcare insurance at the moment. The rest are not. And those who are not are in a public healthcare system, which is fragmented and rife with corruption. You're based in Australia, and you do a lot of work in the US. From your perspective, from a nuclear physicist lens, what is the current state of healthcare systems as you see it?
Absolutely. The world is getting sicker. So by any metric that you want to measure the state of health of the world, it's declining. The medical economy is very well rehearsed in dealing with what I will call acute conditions. But the world is suffering from an epidemic of chronic and mental health conditions. And the medical economy is not equipped to deal with it. Prescribing more therapeutics, the evidence shows, is not the solution. There's a paper that I published back in 2019, pre-pandemic. And there's one plot in that paper that I think of every single day. So we looked at the percentage of the population, this is for the United States, with type 2 diabetes who have their condition under control. And we define this as an A1C level below 7%. And so we plotted this across the last 30 years. And we overlapped on this plot the number of drugs that have been approved by the FDA for type 2 diabetes over the last 30 years. And what we saw was a complete divergence. More drugs, more efficacious therapeutics are coming to the market, but the percentage of the population who have their condition under control is rapidly declining. And so what this tells us, that we can't just outsource the management of chronic conditions. We cannot outsource the epidemic of chronic conditions to the medical economy. And we really need to think in novel and creative ways and complete new strategies on how we prevent, and in the case of onset, regress, and in the case of chronic conditions, slow down their progression. And this requires fundamental new thinking.
Ramin, give us a sense of what's happening in the Australian healthcare system and what you're seeing in the US healthcare system, and perhaps even insights into the UK.
Yep, very, very similar. So when we look at the challenges these healthcare systems are facing, healthcare expenditure as a percentage of GDP is on the rise. Let's look at the US alone. This number is reaching around 20%. Here in Australia, we have a similar challenge. But yet, the prevalence of disease, whether it's chronic condition, whether it's cancer, whether it's mental health, they're all on the rise. Now, what happened is between the years around 2010 to 2020, we had a wave of digital health companies who brought a whole suite of novel care delivery mechanisms, leveraging the power of digital to reduce cost, improve access. But we saw very little movement in terms of tangible outcomes in delivering on these goals. Now, there's a reason for that. And the reason comes down to all these companies built within the boundary conditions of very well-established medical economy, whose incentives and values are already predefined. So it left no room for disruption for these companies. They had to very much accelerate time to reimbursement code. And so the role they ended up playing was accelerating billing, accelerating clinical workflow, very little was done that can be measured tangibly in terms of transforming this system into one that is truly patient-centric and focused on the delivery of the best outcomes for the patient, or in the case of Unleash, we call them consumers. Now, something interesting happened over the last few years. There was this wave of direct-to-consumer healthcare that emerged. So while digital health was largely held hostage to an established healthcare system, these direct-to-consumer companies emerged, and they emerged very much focused on the patient, very much focused on the consumer. But they had one fundamental challenge. We will build and develop systems that are truly patient-centric, but now the patient has to pay. And so scalability of these businesses became the challenge. So the question I always ask is, how do you align incentives with your customers? How do you align outcomes and values at the same time with your customers? And this was a question that it took us around 12 months at Unleash. Extensive roadshow across the US. From the East Coast to the West, we traveled door to door, city to city, and we engaged stakeholders within and outside of the medical economy in order to really understand this fundamental question. How do we align incentives, values, and outcomes for the benefit of the consumer, for the benefit of the patient, to keep consumers healthy?
Ramin, you spoke earlier about a concept of reimagining healthcare, and sometimes we get so used to and immersed in the way things are currently being done that it's difficult for us to conceptualize it being any different. So on your road shows, can you share with us a couple of perceptions that you identified that were common throughout stakeholders in the US around what healthcare should be like?
Absolutely. Well, just to give you a bit of background, at Unleash, we're building a scalable preventative health platform. And so the key word for us was, how do you bring the word health back into healthcare? And so, very much to your point, we made quite a number of interesting observations. The first observation was, well, prevention's actually not new. Right? There's nothing about prevention that us as Unleash sit here and claim we're pioneers in prevention. We're not. It's no new word. It's been around for as long as healthcare and health has been around. But what's happened is that governments, local councils, academic medical centres and universities have been the guardians of prevention. And this is where it became challenging. Because when there was an election where priorities changed across state and federal governments, the budget ran out. The academics published the research showing that these initiatives work, they get results. But at a policy level, politicians looked at it and went, wait a second, this is not going to translate into votes on poll day, at the poll, on election day. Because if I put a hospital in my local district, I am going to by far get more votes than if I worry about the quality of the air, if I worry about ensuring that my community has safety at night time so people can come home after work and hit the road to get some exercise. Well, those preventative initiatives don't get the front page of the newspaper. They're not going to get votes. And so the first strategy when we looked across the US system was, don't rely on government funding in any shape or form to scale prevention. And here was another insight. Prevention is actually not a thing. And prevention should never become a thing. prevention almost needs to be invisible for it to scale. And this is why. And I always ask people this. I say, well, what is prevention? What does it actually mean to be healthy? And when you think about that, you realize it's not really a destination. You don't wake up in the morning and your goal is health and prevention. You wake up in the morning, you want to do well at work, you're thinking about buying a house, you might be thinking about what's for dinner. They're kind of all little destinations, long-term and short-term that you have, but you don't really wake up and go, prevention's a destination. So health and prevention is really the sum of everyday decisions. And so any scalable preventative solution, for it to scale, it needs to be invisible. And there's a very good example of this in the US. There was a diabetes prevention program that was run for the pre-diabetes population of a Medicare Advantage, for Medicare Advantage plan members. And they struggled to hit minimum enrollment. So in this program, zero cost to the consumer, but guess what you had to do? You had to take time off work in order to go and learn how to cook, in order to go to a swimming class, in order to go to a group fitness class. Well, that's not going to work, because guess what? I actually want to make sure there's food on the table. I actually want to make sure there's a roof above my head and I can pay the bills and I can raise my children. Going to a swimming class and learning how to cook, taking time off, that's not going to work. And so the second insight we had is, don't make prevention a thing. And there's one more insight that I just want to share with you. And this is what I call the greatest barrier to scaling preventative health. And it's a byproduct of the fee-for-service model that we globally have, whether it's Australia, South Africa, or the United States. We are dominant fee-for-service systems, which means we are volume-based. And this has a significant implication for consumers. Because in a consumer mindset, healthcare is now treated as a binary event. I am healthy until I'm sick. Because the moment I'm sick, there's a reimbursement code. It actually is cheaper for me to wait till I'm sick to get help, because there is no mechanism for me to seek preventative health. There's no reimbursement code for that. And so consumers are wired to not think about health as a continuum, but as a binary event. And so it is absolute the responsibility of us healthcare innovators to help shift the consumer mindset from a binary to a continuum.
Ramin, you've said so much there that makes one really start to think about how we consider healthcare. And I've been thinking about this principle of ownership. More than a decade ago, I was asked a question by a leader in healthcare saying, what's sitting on your risk register today? And I landed up giving quite a spontaneous response saying, well, the biggest risk is that people start taking ownership of the healthcare and they don't require that much of the drugs or the healthcare system services that they rely on in a reactive manner. But when it comes to any type of risk management, it's around the availability of information so that you're aware of the context and so that you can understand what your options are in terms of healthcare risk mitigation, for example. You come from an academic background, so it's ingrained in you. What are your thoughts around the extent to which people understand their body so that they can do the right thing?
I think that's a great question. And to a large extent, we are responsible for what I would call the large gaps that exist in health literacy. And we know health literacy is low. It sits around less than 10%. These are US statistics. So less than 1 in 10 people are in a position where they can read and absorb information, recognize its credibility, and then act on that information in a way that is going to be positive for their health and well-being. Big challenge. Now, the challenge doesn't stop there, because we have now shifted to what we call Gen Zs, Generation Z, who fundamentally think different than us, Roshni. Because their source of information is not their physician. Their source of information is not the boring articles that you read on WebMD that you would fall asleep within minutes. Their information is coming from TikTok. Their information is coming from the myriad of influencers and Hollywood stars who are walking around beating the drums of health and well-being and feeding information to a generation which is using TikTok as their source of credible scientific medical information. So we are responsible as the guardians of health to do much better in innovating in the way that we deliver the content, in the way that the content can actually help the consumer make tangible, measurable, and effective decisions for their health and well-being. Because guess what? Those influencers, Hollywood stars, and TikTok celebrities, they know how to communicate. They know how to appeal to your hearts. We don't. We're still stuck in the old days that there are only very few credible people who can communicate, of which they don't communicate. That's one aspect. But we should never forget the biggest barrier that we have, where in the US healthcare system alone, it's worth $4.3 trillion. And this is the misaligned incentives. And there is one event that I'm very happy to speak publicly about here with you today, Roshni, and this was in the month of November. I attended the health conference. This is probably what I would call the preeminent conference on healthcare innovation in Las Vegas in the US. And at an after event party, I was sharing a drink with the chief medical officer of what I would call one of the most reputable, well-known health systems in the United States. And so we got talking about Unleash. And with a very dismissive tone, the moment he understood that we are scaling prevention across the population, he turned around and said, Ramin, every time I hear the ambulance sirens or the helicopter landing on the pad, I smile. That's around $500,000 to my top line. And then he tapped me on the shoulder and walked away. And it was at that point I pulled out my phone and I tweeted, the path to health is not via healthcare. And so we've got a battle of incentives. We've got a battle of misinformation, which us as scientists and clinicians are actually losing. And we've got a misalignment around the outcomes and values that we seek for our customers in the medical economy, which we call patients.
Ramin, I think that's a good seg into taking our conversation back into focusing on your business model, your vision, and how you see it coming together. So you spoke about the focus continuing to be on the top line, and that's important to sustain the financial investment that's required in healthcare. So that's always going to be there. But if we're looking at brands and those who market brands, I mean, their primary role is to help the business maximize profits. Now, you're going to that cohort to say, please help us incentivize preventative healthcare, partner with Unleash Health. My question to you is, what can big brands do in this space, and why? Why should they invest in healthcare?
That's a great question. And if going back to the conversation we had around engaging stakeholders in and out of the medical economy, on a roadshow of 12 months, we spoke to the big health systems. We spoke to the pharmaceutical companies. We spoke to some of the best known brands in consumer health and wellness across many pillars: apparel and footwear, general fitness, vitamins and dietary supplements, food and beverage, consumer tech, personal care, you name it, we sat there and we had those conversations. And from it emerged the one key insight, which was the foundation of Unleash, and that is these everyday consumer brands are far more incentivized and influential in keeping everyday consumers and their communities healthy than anyone in the medical economy. And two reasons. I really want to drill down on two words there. Incentives. Healthy consumers earn more, spend more, buy more premium products. That's a perfect alignment. And the second, what we call influence. Influence in shaping behavior, because in order to prevent the myriad of chronic conditions that we spoke about, and even cancers, we know that 40% of cancers can be prevented because 8 out of the top 10 causes of cancer are all behavioral: alcohol consumption, nutrition, fitness, movement. But brands have an advantage that the medical economy doesn't. Brands are present in our day-to-day life. And that's fundamental to behavior change. The medical economy doesn't have that advantage. Remember, we consume it as a binary event. We typically consume it when it's too late. But brands are in our life every day. And I always use this phrase in every conversation, whether it's at a conference face-to-face or on any podcast, and I say your pair of Nike running shoes are far more influential in shaping your behavior than any physician, because they're there, they're in your life, and if you are a lover of that brand has a tremendous impact in shaping the way you live your life. And this is key and fundamental to why brands are best positioned to prioritize the health and well-being of their customers and their communities. And what we do at Unleash, we're building the infrastructure to enable these consumer brands do this and do it seamlessly, where we create a triple win: a win for the brand, a win for the consumer, and above all, a win for society.
Ramin, thank you. And you've clearly spelled out the why, as in why should brands get involved in healthcare? And it takes my mind to what's happening with climate change. Yes, the World Advertising Authority has a planet pledge that focuses on green marketing, green branding, etc. Yet we're getting a negative consequence, which is greenwashing, and perhaps that's a short-term thing, and over time that will be diluted to become more effective. In the space of healthcare, a greenwashing type of situation could have real negative consequences on lives. And that's exactly what you're trying to improve. So in your model, Ramin, what type of support are you offering to your stakeholders, to your business partners, to the brands to get this right and to ensure that there's no misinformation that's put out there through their marketing messages?
Absolutely. So at the core Unleash is a total health and wellness platform. And so if we zoom in and drill down on the word total, we will better understand the roadmap ahead of us. Let's just take an example. Let's say you do a genomic testing, and from that emerges the result that you have a higher predisposition to Alzheimer's. And so you're worried about it. So what do you do then? Is there really a magic pill that anyone can prescribe you in the medical economy? No. From that point on, your journey is all about lifestyle and behavior change in order to ensure that you can delay the onset of Alzheimer's. Let's use another example. You want to lose weight. What we do at Unleash is we help you with all the behavioral change aspects around all these goals. But then what happens after you lost weight? There's a problem there. And that is you need to build strength, otherwise you'll end up with a hip fracture. And unfortunately, post-hip fracture is typically, the outlook is pretty grim. And so what's important around total health and wellness is to recognize that a consumer's health is multidimensional. For too long, even in the consumer health space, we built a myriad of one-dimensional solutions. And then what we did is we charged consumers, and we still do this today, for every solution. You want to lose weight, you're going to pay tens of dollars for subscription to one company. You have a mental health challenge, you've got to pay tens of dollars to another company. But the reality is your health is a continuum. So give people the ability to address the totality of their health needs across mind, body, overall performance, even family. And so that's one core pillar that is, as a company of scientists and clinicians, we're very much focused on. Create a dynamic platform that allows people to change their goals as life goes on. We really consider ourselves as the health and wellness platform, or your companion or your partner for life. And then the second aspect is what we fundamentally are proud of, the element around health equity and accessibility, is make it free for the consumer. Because typically what happens when I'm paying tens of dollars every single month to use an app that addresses one dimension of my health, well, as soon as I hit that goal, I cancel my subscription. That's if in the first place I could afford that subscription. And then guess what? We're back to the beginning again. I've lost my companion. And I'm very proud that at Unleash, we are scientists, we are clinicians, and fundamental to everything we do is science. What we do leverage is the influence and power of brands in helping the science, in helping the behavior change mechanisms, in addition to ensuring that consumers have access to what we call the right toolkit to get them to that health goal. And again, I emphasize, not every brand is a customer here. These are brands who already have health equity as part of their brand equity. This is not a relationship that we will ever build with brands who do not prioritize the health and well-being of their communities. But what we help to do is to validate it and to scale that capability for these brands.
Ramin, what you're referring to sounds like an integrated health prevention model, which requires multiple stakeholders. So could you give us a better understanding of, in addition to the brands that you are engaging with, who are the other key stakeholders who makes up your ecosystem?
That's a great question. I would start by looking at three primary stakeholders. And the number one stakeholder is not the medical economy. It's not consumer brands. It's consumers. We fundamentally decided to build for the consumer and to do that in the true sense of the word because we aligned incentives for the consumer. There is no shortage of companies that talk about consumer centricity, an obsession, or some have now elevated that conversation to life centricity. And all these words sound great, and when you show up at Davos, it gets a lot of attention and gets you right up there in the newsfeed. But you can only achieve that if the incentives, values, and outcomes are aligned for the consumer. And so that's our primary stakeholder. And our second stakeholder are consumer brands. Because brands also have a lot to gain from this. And let me share you some examples of where brands stand to win. So remember, we spoke about the large volume of misinformation of what I call influencer and Hollywood health and well-being routines and products that have just saturated social media. We help brands bring their message to the consumer in a way that is scientifically and clinically validated. We help brands educate the consumers in a very evidence-based manner. And we also leverage the complementarity or the complementary nature of brands across different verticals of the health and wellness economy, which can, as you mentioned, take an integrated approach to ensuring that the consumers are the ultimate beneficiaries. And don't underestimate the win for society, because consumer brands are the guardian of that dimension. And you mentioned ESG. We do greenwashing, but do we do social and governance washing? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But what we are now fundamentally enabling consumers brands to do is to demonstrate, validate their impact across social and governance. And we can help them demonstrate that.
So Ramin, as I understand it, you are offering a solution to the brands, and this means it's harvesting data that is input by the user, who's the ultimate consumer, and that immediately springs to mind the question around data management, confidentiality of something so sensitive like one's health. Referring to the technology that's going to be underpinning your platform, how are you going to be addressing this?
That's probably, I would say, the most important question that needs to always be asked and needs to always be addressed head on. And I like to almost answer that question with another question, and that is, how is your data being harvested today on social media? It's to drive consumerism. It's to drive eyes on the screen, fingers on the like buttons. We are inverting that paradigm to ensure engagement in the data that we use to drive it is consumerism for good. It is consumerism for net health positive engagement. Now the question might be, well, where does that data come from? Because when we look at the $4.3 trillion of the US medical economy, 90% of that figure is only focused on 10 to 20% of our healthcare outcome drivers. This is basically our ability to access a medical facility and get medical care. There is no data today that is longitudinally complete for a consumer. That is that 80%. 80% of our healthcare outcome drivers, no one has any visibility in. And these are our day-to-day health behaviours, what we call the behaviourome, and the environmentome, your social determinants of health. And so if we look at the evolution of data generation, we have imaging data, lab data, electronic health record data. Then came the omics revolution. The cost of sequencing your genome dropped from millions of dollars. Recently, Illumina announced $200 for full sequencing. Amazing. But what I now am very adamant about is your zip code will tell me more than your genetic code. And your digital footprint will tell me more than your zip code and genetic code combined. And so it is absolute paramount that the data that today consumers are generating are used to benefit consumers, not for mass advertising, not for mass consumerism and eyes on the screen, but leveraging that data in order to ensure that we can help consumers day in and day out with improving their health. We can help ensure that consumers are getting access to goods, products, services that are relevant to them and that are going to help them overcome their social determinants of health barriers. This is what the role of data should be in the year 2023. And this is where, as Unleash, we're very proud to shift the consumer brand space towards one that is for the consumer, one that benefits the consumer, and one that is absolutely centered on healthy societies.
So, Ramin, I asked that question specifically because we're sitting now in an era or at a time where technology is moving forward quite rapidly. I mean, we've heard about OpenAI, ChatGPT has been launched, and technology can be used for good, and there are huge benefits to it, and we have no choice but to adapt and accept it because that is the future. But it can also be used to exploit and to manipulate. So, just listening to you, I'm thinking, and I realize how long it's taken for the road to climate change to become such a topical agenda that governments, businesses around the world has bought into. And so it's almost like we need a Paris Agreement for healthcare, because at the moment it's great if certain jurisdictions focus on getting healthcare improved within their own country. But healthcare is a universal requirement, and we're becoming global citizens. So as we move between borders, as different viruses start emerging, as data is available, whether I sit in South Africa or Australia, I've still got access to my data there too. I'm just starting to wonder, how does all this get coordinated centrally? Because there has to be something that pulls all this forward into one direction. What are your thoughts on my observations?
The reality is that there's always going to be the next shiny object. And I think we need to take a fundamentally far more grounded approach in healthcare. We can be absolutely mesmerized by the next AI revolution or leap forward. But end of the day, we've got to really recognize, what are we solving? We're solving for rates of chronic conditions, cancer, mental health, that are unprecedented in human history. And so what is fundamentally important is to not lose sight of the goal, not lose sight of the vision. There isn't a day that goes by where within and outside of the medical economy, another company doesn't emerge where the message is around AI, the message is around machine learning, and you probably notice even with the vast amounts of data we ingest every day as we build, unleash, and train our algorithms, I didn't once mention AI and machine learning. Because the attention is not to be on the AI and machine learning, the attention is to be on the way that we leverage the insights and the findings from these large data sets to solve for human health. And this is what, unfortunately, we're losing sight of. We constantly think about bigger and bigger data sets, more sophisticated algorithms. We constantly actually think about more advanced therapies. And don't get me wrong, the therapeutics have a very noble and an important role to play. But what we stand for at Unleash is what if? What if we created the environment, the data-driven environment, where prevention was prioritized, being healthy was prioritized, and consumers were enabled to achieve it? And what if we are standing for a medical economy where a prescription is not the solution to every health condition? What if we augmented prevention with medical interventions? And we see this today because we get approached by some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Because even pharmaceutical companies recognize, and I'm a veteran of that industry, that therapeutics have a limited efficacy in the real world. That if you augment an existing therapy, whether it's a semaglutide for weight loss, I mentioned earlier whether it's a PCSK9 to reduce your cholesterol levels, and you augment it with a mechanism that prioritizes healthy behaviors, and you help show the path to the consumer, you will be a lot more successful.
So, Ramin, I really want to help listeners understand where Unleash is at, because I think you've put forward the value proposition quite well and unpacked, the why. Now let's understand the how. So you did explain to me, and we were speaking earlier before the podcast, that Unleash is in the developmental phase. How are things going? Where in your startup life cycle are you? And have any big brands signed on yet?
Absolutely. We're deep in development mode. So we're in, I guess, what you would call it the stay humble and stay quiet and just keep building day in and day out. We're under NDA with about a dozen global brands and emerging impact brands. And those conversations are progressing forward. We're very proud to be launching over the coming months with a small subset of leading brands who are going to be very complementary in nature, focused on what we call total health and wellness. So, we're very excited about the future. We're in a phase of the company where we're learning from the customers. We're learning, and our customers are consumer brands, and our customers are everyday citizens of the world. So we run user studies in the Midwest of the United States. We run user studies on Sydney Harbour. We run user studies in the outback of Australia, because what we're building is for everyone in this world. We're not building a solution that is what I would call for the healthy, wealthy, privileged. It is for everyone. And that is core to our mission. It is core, something that we will always stand true to. And we're very excited about the road ahead to 1 billion lives by 2033.
And Dr. Ramin, that is something that did strike me. I mean, 1 billion people is about 12.5% of an 8 billion worldwide population. And when I think about big brands, I think about big brands serving a certain segment of the markets globally. How would your solution ensure or advocate that no one gets left behind?
Twofold. The first one is all that we build is free for the consumer. There is absolute no barrier to adoption for a consumer. And the second element is we leverage the scale of consumer brands in order to ensure that we reach every corner of the world. And not only that, but we leverage the sponsorship of leading brands and emerging brands to ensure that health and wellness is also accessible for everyone in every corner of the world. So we're very excited and we're truly passionate by the mission and the direction that we've set.
Ramin, last question. As a scientist, as an experienced person in the VC environment, as a board leader yourself, and as an academic, what is the desired state for healthcare in 2030, and what part can business leaders, communities, organizations play in your vision for 2033?
The vision is very simple. And there's two parts to this vision. Every consumer in the world is empowered with the knowledge and the tools to be able to make the best decisions every single day that culminate in a long, healthy, prosperous life. That's the first. And then the second vision is ensuring that health is everyone's business.
Ramin, that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you very, very much for making time to speak with us today. I know that you've got another engagement to run to, so we won't hold you up for too much longer, but thank you for sharing your vision.
Roshni, it's been a pleasure, fun discussion, fun conversation. Thank you for this opportunity.
So, from what I took away from the conversation is that preventative healthcare is a choice, and it's probably the biggest investment that we as individuals, as leaders, in our families or our businesses or communities can make, either in prevention or in education to ensure improved healthcare. So listening to this conversation today, how can we contribute to Dr. Ramin's vision of improving 1 billion lives by 2030 or 2032 or 2033, whatever the case may be. So thank you for choosing to listen to Lift As We Rise, and be sure to lift as we rise so that together and with a healthy purpose, we can thrive. We'll see you again next time. Take care and bye-bye.